Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice from the Jacksonville Urban League. Our center has a number of town halls, virtual town halls throughout the year, focusing on various topics. And tonight, we're going to talk about the Superfund and impacts of toxic waste on land in Jacksonville and the problem generally. And we're pleased to have with us tonight Harmonie Chang, who will be facilitating and presenting, along with Jimmy Orth from the Riverkeeper. We're grateful that they're speaking to us tonight. Harmonie is an intern at the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice, and I want to welcome the other interns who are with us, particularly Sadia Barge, our coordinator. We're so grateful for all the work that they do for the Urban League and for Jacksonville. And they come from all over the country with a passion for social justice and policy change. So with that, I will turn it over to Harmonie as I thank all of you on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League for being here. Take it away, Harmonie.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. Yeah, I'm an intern at the Jacksonville Urban League, and I'm currently studying biology and sociology at Fordham University in New York. And yeah, I'm really excited about this. And Jimmy, do you want to introduce yourself too?
Sure.
Of types of
Give a brief intro. I'm Jimmy Orth. I'm the executive director of St. John's Riverkeeper. We're a nonprofit advocacy group for the St. John's River. We advocate for policies that will be protective of the river, and we work with government agencies and the public to make sure that those laws and regulations are being implemented and being enforced. We also do a lot with outreach and education to get people more informed about the river and understand the St. John's, but also to try to connect people to the river. We do a lot of outings, getting people out to experience it firsthand. So I've been with Riverkeeper for 20 years now, and looking forward to this program tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you again for being here tonight. I'm just gonna kind of get right into the topics that we are going to focus on tonight. First, we're going to be discussing what even are Superfund sites, focusing on their history and significance to social justice. The next topic we're going to be going into is the health and environmental effects of Superfund sites. And last, we're going to discuss policy that attempts to address these sites and what we as individuals can do to better navigate this issue. And there's a lot that we want to talk about, so we're gonna get right into it. So again, first, what even are Superfund sites? We were talking about it a little bit at the beginning, but like the name Superfund, like it has really nothing to do with what Superfund sites actually are. They're essentially toxic waste sites that form due to the improper management, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste by local governments and large corporations. And Superfund is actually a colloquial term that is used to address these sites, appointed by the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. And the reason why the EPA and the government has taken such steps to address issues that come up with these sites is because they've been linked to a lot of problems, notably higher incidences of long-term cognitive issues, higher rates of cancer, lower property value and economic growth, environmental deterioration, and an overall lower standard of living. And you might be wondering, why is this even significant to Jacksonville? Well, Florida actually has the second highest number of Superfund sites in the country, and Jacksonville houses a majority of them. And research has continuously shown that people of color, notably Black and Hispanic people, are more likely to live near these Superfund sites and bear the weight of these consequences that I just mentioned. And yeah, it's just like really unfortunate. This image is of the Kerr-McGee Chemical Corp in Jacksonville, which is located on the west bank of the St. Johns River. And this is just one of like a few big ones in Jacksonville. And the reason why this happens is no coincidence. It's because of redlining. Redlining was a policy implemented by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which essentially they allocated mortgages to people. They created these maps of desirability, which graded areas based on things like land quality, development, business aspirations, and like other indicators of economic prosperity and like general like well-being. But as I'm sure a lot of us know, this wasn't the case. These maps were just ways to essentially rate areas based on ethnic makeup and like racial makeup. Redlined areas, which were the least desirable areas, were often rated as the least desirable because they had higher percentages of people of color living there, and that was the only reason why. These areas received significantly lower amounts of government funding and received fewer approvals for home mortgages and loans. And consequently, this kind of decreased the economic prospects of these areas and obviously was not good for the people living in these areas. And though redlining has been outlawed for a few decades, we can still see the effects of it in the present. First of all, these areas still are receiving less government funding. This has led to fewer government and like public resources, inadequate school systems. There's also significantly lower property values, fewer incidences of home ownership, like limited access to like fresh and healthy foods. And there's also significant environmental issues associated with previously redlined areas. And in particular, previously redlined areas are actually 6 degrees Celsius warmer on average compared to their non-redlined counterparts. Pretty significant. And another one of the consequences of redlining is the location of Superfund sites. So just as a visual, this map right here is a map of is a redlining map of Jacksonville from Richmond University. Obviously the pink/red is like a redlined area. The green and the blue are desirable. Yellow is like okay. And right here, this is the St. Johns River, like over to the right. This is a racial dot map of Jacksonville, with the green representing Black populations. And you can definitely see in the same area where it was redlined, there's definitely a significantly higher Black population. And this last map is from the EPA, and it shows all of the hazardous waste sites in Jacksonville. And again, it's the same section of Jacksonville that has all of these Superfund sites, really houses like all of them. Again, previously redlined, also very high Black population. Again, this is not a coincidence. Yeah, and really, this is kind of evident of a much larger issue. People and communities of color in Jacksonville are subject to the inequalities of the past, the adverse effects that come with unjust urban planning and systematic racism. And yeah, and so
Can I say one thing I wanted to
yeah.
tell that I thought was an interesting statistic? I was doing a little research on this, and 70% of the country's Superfund sites that are listed on the national priority list are located also within 1 mile of government assisted housing. And what we obviously know is that the majority of HUD and government assisted housing are households of color. And so even our government, has been obviously complicit in this problem.
Yeah, definitely. And I was also, just to add a little more to that, it's not just Superfund sites and toxic waste. There was another organization, like I think it was called the Clean Air Task Force. They did a report as well, and that showed that I think also like 70–80% of people of color are in a fence line community. So they're in a community that is very close to air pollutants, toxic waste, things like that. And it's just really shocking because, again, like this is a pattern, and this is just one like piece of evidence of this pattern. But yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, we're talked a lot about the socio-political context of Superfund sites, but there's also a lot of health and environmental effects that are like very tangible, and they've pretty much been going like unresolved and unnoticed by local governments. There are things being done, but it's not really enough. Yeah, so I think some of the most prominent effects are on human health. Research from throughout the years on Superfund sites in Florida and like nationwide have pretty much all made the same conclusion, that these toxins that are present at these sites have very detrimental and even fatal consequences on people's health. So, for example, their cancer is 17% more likely in areas that are near Superfund sites. Children are 10% more likely to have learning disabilities if they are born near and like grow up near a Superfund site. And people living near Superfund sites have shorter life expectancies of around 1.22 years on average. And overall, generally speaking, there's just a lower standard of living. And this is pretty detrimental, especially in Jacksonville. And Jacksonville's pretty unique because of its geography and the ecology there, because it is a floodplain located right on the St. Johns River. Because it's a floodplain, the contaminants in the soil could be subject to leaching, which is essentially just when stormwater and runoff can like pick up contaminants in the soil and spread them further than where they were originally. This means that contaminants could be present all throughout Jacksonville, and this has led to many environmental issues, particularly with the waterways. So Jimmy, if I'll let you, yeah, talk about that.
Sure. One thing I'm going to add to the human health impacts as well is related to stress. I think that's the thing that is really interesting that I had not even really thought about until recently. I was listening to a podcast, and it was about some of the impacts to African Americans from racist policies. And one of the things is stress. African Americans suffer from stress-related illnesses at a much higher rate than the general population. And part of that's due to a lot of obviously reasons we know why, how racism can affect stress levels. But one is just the fact that when you live in an area that you're next to or close to a site that is known to be toxic, even if if federal government or local government tells you that it's been cleaned up, there's always that distrust for good reasons, because in a lot of cases, these Superfund sites have remained in those communities for years. There's been government has dragged their feet on cleaning it up. And then there's always questions about whether it was cleaned up to the degree that's necessary to prevent impacts to human health. And so I really didn't think about that until recently, about what it would be like to live next to a site that is known to have carcinogens and cancer-causing chemicals that could impact your children. I know it goes back to years ago when I was involved when the city first took responsibility for cleaning up some of the Superfund sites in Jacksonville, the incinerator ash sites in particular. And there was concern about a school, that Mary Bethune Elementary School, that was located in Northwest Jacksonville, and it was located on top of contaminated incinerator ash. They built a school on this. And so they went in and cleaned it up. And there was of course, the health department and this local government said, it's fine. It's fine. We put down 2 feet of soil. Everything's good. There's no pathway to exposure. And the community was concerned. They were like, how do I know? How do I know for sure that my child isn't going to be in the playground, dig in the soil, and get exposed to these contaminants? So there's always that unknown factor too, that can really cause a lot of stress. And then, as you mentioned, the environmental consequences. I mean, a lot of these chemicals are chemicals that persist in the environment for an awful long time. In fact, a lot of the contaminants were placed there decades ago. In the case, for instance, of the incinerator ash sites in Jacksonville, which, by the way, the city operated 2 municipal solid waste incinerators from 1910 to the 1960s. And what they did is they took this ash that was contaminated with all kinds of heavy metals and toxic chemicals, and they would place it in dump sites in primarily African-American communities, and also use it for fill to put in for new housing development, like in the Ribault, Moncrief Creek area of Jacksonville. And so they used it to fill to build houses on top of. And this ash contains all kinds of nasty chemicals that can be extremely harmful to health. And so what happens, like you mentioned before, is it can also run off into our waterways, which it does frequently. As a matter of fact, Lonnie Miller Park, if you're familiar with that, up on the Northwest Jacksonville on the Ribault River. And then there's also, there was a dump site that's located along the Ribault a little farther upstream, close to New Kings Road, that was on the Ribault. These were directly placed right on the waterways. And there's still sections that haven't been cleaned up, and those contaminants over the years have made their way into the waterways, and then they get bound up in the sediments on the bottom. Those sediments can get stirred up and resuspended in the water column. And then, like you mentioned before, they can go out with a tide and be spread for long distances, really, and then impact the fish. The fish bioaccumulate these chemicals, toxins, heavy metals in their tissues. And then that can magnificate, as you mentioned in here, where it actually, as they eat fish higher up on the food chain, eat smaller fish, and they accumulate more and more of this in their tissue. And then, of course, when we as humans, we eat the fish, because a lot of people on these waterways that these Superfund sites are adjacent to, they fish, they eat the fish, and then that can also obviously cause health problems for humans.
Yeah, definitely. And the biomagnification is so crazy, because I know, like, pregnant women are not supposed to eat like large fish, and it's because of biomagnification. But the thing is, it's like these things are happening in like so many of like these fish that people in Jacksonville are eating, and it's just kind of like maybe not like talked about enough. And also about like the stress levels. It's also like, just to kind of like further prove that point, like I believe like African Americans have some of the highest rates of like cardiovascular disease and like heart disease and things that are, primarily caused by stress. And that is also I mean, there's really no coincidence there. It's yeah.
Well, and like you mentioned with the challenge we have is we can develop cleanup plans and remediation plans to clean up the contaminated the contaminants from Superfund sites on the land. It's not, I mean, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's much easier to clean up those. Once it gets into the waterway, much harder to remove those contaminants and heavy metals, because what ends up happening is, as I mentioned, it gets into the sediments in the bottom. So there's decisions that have to be made. Are you going to go in and are you going to dredge out that material? What are you going to do with the dredged out material? When you dredge, you're also resuspending a lot of those sediments that into the water column, so then they could spread further. And so there's a lot of, and it's extremely expensive to do. And then also there's not that much water quality testing that's done to really assess how severe the problem is. And like, for instance, even with fish, there's not extensive fish tissue testing in a lot of the tributaries that are affected by the Superfund sites in Jacksonville. And so we don't really know the extent of the problem.
Yeah, definitely. And the problem of like not testing the water kind of brings us into our next topic, which is policy. So I kind of mentioned this earlier. There are things being done to clean up these sites, but time and time again, and from like evidence and looking at the environment and looking at the health effects and like incidences of cancer and all of these things, there's clearly still an issue because these problems are still happening. And a primary reason for this, not just in Jacksonville, but also in New Jersey, my home state, where Superfund sites are also an issue, is that there's just a lack of knowledge. There's a lack of like media attention and just public knowledge of this issue and even like what they are, what they're causing, and like what they're doing to our health and to our environment. And I think that this has allowed a lot of politicians and policymakers to become apathetic towards this issue. And they prioritize other things that are just as important, but not caring about these problems at all, is so detrimental and is really not going to, help anyone. I think mobilizing people and like educating people about these problems and that we need to do something about it can help promote long-lasting legislative change that will ensure the toxicity of Superfund sites and their effects on communities is a problem of the past. Because again, like you say, like there's not enough testing of the waterways, and that's stuff that we have to fix with policy change. One way I wanted to mention that we as individuals can kind of get involved in, this is a really great like direct service opportunity, is participating in the Great St. John's River Cleanup. So organizations throughout Northeast Florida come together to organize a month of river cleanups, and it's actually occurring right now. And if you scan your, like use your phone to scan the QR code, you can find cleanups in your area. Jimmy, I don't know if you want to say anything else about that.
Sure. Yeah, we decided 2 years ago to try to get more participation and coordination really throughout the watershed of the St. John's, to participate in cleanups over this period of time. For those watching, you may not realize how large the St. John's River is. It's actually it's 310 miles in length, but the watershed, the land area that drains into the river and all its tributaries, is about 9,000 square miles, which is about 15% of the state of Florida. So we've got 7 counties throughout the watershed that are participating this year that are having cleanups during this period of time. We also are working with some corporations to do some cleanups, and then encouraging people even to clean up around their own house. I mean, you don't have to be part of a formal cleanup. You can do it on your own. Grab a bag, some gloves, head out and clean up your neighborhood, clean up the streets along your street, even though you might not live on the waterfront. A lot of those storm drains end up going straight to the St. John's River or its tributaries. So anything that is picked up by that storm water, trash and chemicals and different things like that, makes its way into the St. John's. And that's the thing. While this isn't necessarily about Superfund sites, it is about pollution. And that's one of the really concerning things about trash. Once it makes its way into our waterways, it's sometimes hard to remove. Plastics in particular, they break down over time. A lot of you probably have heard of microplastics that end up becoming ingested by the fish and can be harmful to wildlife and even to ourselves. We all have, unfortunately, microplastics in our bodies right now in our bloodstream. And also just can release a lot of harmful chemicals. So like plastic bags, for instance, when they break down, there was a study done a couple of years ago that there's about 13,000 chemical compounds in plastic bags, and not all of them are toxic, but many of them are. And those are released into the environment as they break down over time. So it's really important that we get involved. And this is one fairly easy thing we can all do, is get out there and help pick up trash and clean up the river.
Yeah, definitely. And if you can't scan the QR code, I also dropped the link to the website that'll like locate cleanups in your area. And yeah, and I guess kind of getting into current policy issues, I think like a big thing is there's like a lack of funding. There's not enough money allocated towards cleanup and maintenance efforts. And Jimmy, like you were saying earlier, like there is testing, but not enough. And with more money, you know, we can fix that. It's also like non-exhaustive. I know that some of the chemical sites, I don't think it's just in Jacksonville, but they are told like, oh, your runoff and your waste cannot have over a certain amount of XYZ chemical in it. This is the policy, these are the rules, and these big corporations are expected to follow it. But the problem is there's no one, you know, actually checking that. There's no like agency, or there's no people like that are actually going out and checking their runoff waste to see if like this is actually like happening. So it really reminds me, it's like a lot of like talk and not enough action. And yeah, Mr. Orth.
Well, yeah, I think I think you're right. I mean, one, we don't in a lot of cases test enough or test for the right things. So in other words, you know, like for instance, the city of Jacksonville has a pretty extensive testing program for fecal coliform bacteria, for instance, but that's not really giving us a better understanding of the types of contaminants that are often contained in these Superfund sites, in these areas that, you know, these contaminated areas adjacent to our waterways. In regards to funding, that's another thing is, and policy, we've drug our feet for so many years. Good example is, you know, I told you how long ago it was those incinerator ashes. That was the 1910 to the 1960s. And it wasn't really until the 1985 that the local government in Jacksonville acknowledged responsibility for those incinerator ashes. Well, it wasn't until about 2000 that we actually started cleaning up. So it went about 15 years before any action started taking place. Well, now think about it now. We still haven't finished the process. We still have not cleaned up those sites, and here we are in 2024. So this is this is something that the urgency has often not been there. One thing I am excited about, or I think is positive news, is the city is getting close to wrapping up the remediation for most of the sites in Jacksonville. Unfortunately, the sites, the areas that still remain are the areas that are closest to the waterway. So we're advocating to make sure we let's expedite that process, get it cleaned up. The other thing that's encouraging is that the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in Congress, that appropriated $21 billion for cleaning up Superfund sites and other contaminated sites. So that's good news. We've finally are getting some funding that is being appropriated by Congress to help with this process. And then another thing that I when I was doing some research is that in 2021, the EPA has a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and they came out with an extensive report on all kinds of recommendations that the EPA can implement to, one, expedite the cleanup of Superfund sites, but really importantly, to improve the community outreach and engagement of citizens. Because you mentioned this earlier, a lot of times it's really hard. People don't know, aren't aware of what they can do or the process. It's very complicated, some of these laws, and the remediation process itself is hard to track and to understand what's happening. And so I think that's at least encouraging. Like you said, we don't want just more talk or more studies. We want action. But it looks like the EPA seems to be more inclined to try to expedite cleanup with more funding and policies that are going to hopefully make this happen quicker and get the job done finally. And, you know, one thing we got to learn too is we got to learn from our mistakes from the past, and hopefully we're not going to commit the sins of the past, and we're going to figure out how not to pollute our environment. Because as we see, once we put these type of toxic chemicals out there in the environment, it's really hard and expensive, frankly, to clean up and to get to remediate these areas.
Yeah, and yeah, like you said, there is a lot of work being done, and it is very hopeful. And I hope that it is things like this, like getting like people involved and organized, really spearheading a lot of these changes. And yeah, and like I guess kind of speaking about the waterways, I kind of wanted to talk about the River cleanup. So this is kind of something that really made me think about how it's like non-exhaustive, these cleanups, because I remember you mentioned, Jimmy, this site has been mostly remediated, like that's like the green, but the yellow is parts that haven't been um remediated yet, and like they are right up against the river, and like you said, with contaminants getting into the water, it's really hard and like honestly impossible to like efficiently and like cost effectively remove them from the water. And like once it's in the water, it's everywhere pretty much.
Right.
um
Absolutely.
yeah.
Well, this is a part of an initiative called Resilient Rebuilt. It's a partnership with LISC Jacksonville that St. John's Riverkeeper is working on. And one aspect of this project is to really advocate for the remediation, cleanup, and of the Superfund sites that exist in this area. This is an area that borders, as you mentioned just a minute ago, the Ribault River, but also Moncrief Creek. And we still have, like this is Lonnie Miller Park, which is on the Ribault. Can't access the river right now because it's fenced off because a good portion of this is still contaminated. The good news is the city is issuing an RFP to get proposals from contractors to clean up the middle section of that yellow, but there's still going to be some sections along the Ribault, because that's the last section they're going to remediate, that will still need to be cleaned up. And I don't think there's funding still available. So that's something that's really important, that we make sure that the funding's there and that this process it happens really quickly. Because this area is, we talked about before, and I think is really important, is that it's not just environmental impacts. The area in the Ribault Moncrief area that we are working in, it is vulnerable not just from environmental contaminants and exposure to pollution, but it's also highly vulnerable from a socioeconomic standpoint, and from flooding too, because it's a very low-lying area, which then the flooding compounds the problem with the contaminants running off the site and exposure to humans and to wildlife. And so I think that's really important to understand. Something too, I'm just going to mention real quick, because I forgot to mention earlier, a little bit broader area, which is Health Zone 1 in Jacksonville. There's 6 health zones. And Health Zone 1 includes this area. So it's zip codes 32208, 09, 54, 04, 02, and 06. And in that area, 81% as minority population. 31% of Jacksonville has a Black population. So you think about that. And then also it has the highest poverty rate in Duval County. So these problems are compounded when we look at this, like the environmental stress and impacts, the economic vulnerabilities that some communities are facing, health risks that they're facing. And so it just makes those living conditions much worse. This area also has 8 Superfund sites in it. So it's got a high proportion of Superfund sites in this area as well. And they're not all incinerator ash. There's also a Fairfax wood treaters plant that has historically polluted Moncrief Creek. There's also the Kerr-McGee chemical site that you mentioned on the east side. That's right on the St. Johns River, that would produce fertilizers and pesticides. That's heavily contaminated. That's been cleaned up recently. But yeah, this is something that this area of town is really an important area that we need to focus on, because of the compounding effect of a lot of these different stressors. But that also, it's an area that's been neglected historically by Jacksonville.
Yeah, exactly. You said it pretty much perfectly. Like I couldn't say any other way. But yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah. I wanted to kind of end with this quote from Claire Goforth, who's a journalist at The Guardian. This quote's actually from Dr. Irvin Cohen, who's the executive director of LISC Jacksonville. So he's saying proposals to invest in infrastructural improvements are even more difficult without effective communication with the Black community, which Cohen said had historically been an afterthought among local leaders. And, as we just spent a lot of time discussing, I think we can really see that that's true, but it does seem that, things are changing, things are looking up. And I guess, yeah, like things are getting better, hopefully. And yeah, so that's pretty much it for our presentation. I did see that there was some questions in the chat, and if anyone else has any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Okay. Patrick asked, what information do you have about the Bridgeport barge that spilled coal ash into the water off the coast of Jack's Beach? Do we know where the ash went? Are they still bringing barges of coal ash to our port? So, Jimmy, I don't know. Have you heard about that?
Yeah, this is a barge that was bringing incinerator ash because they still obviously produce incinerator ash from coal. It was coal ash that they brought over from Puerto Rico. Because what happened is years ago, Puerto Rico actually banned the storage of coal ash on the island. And so the company, I believe it was AES, had to get rid of this somewhere. So what they were doing is, and they still do, is they're exporting this coal ash from Puerto Rico into the United States through a terminal, a facility at along the St. Johns River, and then it's being offloaded from the barge and transferred to a toxic landfill up in Georgia. And so this barge, there was some really bad weather offshore. It had some complications, and it ended up spilling this ash into the ocean off the coast of Jacksonville, a little ways off from the mouth of the St. Johns River. And unfortunately, this is a situation where the response time of our state agencies, environmental agencies, was not fast enough. We didn't secure the contents of that barge quick enough, and so a lot of it did spill into the waterway. And then the response in terms of testing and seeing what the extent of the damage was it was a really slow reaction to it. So unfortunately, we weren't ever really able to determine how harmful that spill was because they didn't get out there quick enough. And part of it was the conditions in the ocean at the time, but part of it was also they didn't take quick action to get out there and try to figure out what was going on. And so we don't know the extent of it, unfortunately. I wish we did, but I think it was a lesson hopefully learned that there needs to be more stringent regulations on how this ash is being transported. We actually spearheaded with Surfrider Foundation a petition to try to get Jacksonville to ban the import, because what happened is actually, I forgot about this, actually before it was coming into Jacksonville, it was coming into Osceola County, and they actually banned it. They said, no, we're not taking this contaminated ash anymore. We don't want it in our landfills. And so we tried to get it banned here, but I know our Waterways Commission did look into this and propose some more stringent regulations. So hopefully we can avoid this from happening again. Actually, it's interesting too, is if Dr. Jerry Pinto's on this too, if he has anything else he wanted to add, he was.
Oh, Jimmy, I think you muted for a second at the end.
Yep. I was just saying that Dr. Pinto is on this town hall participating, and if he may have some additional information that he's on the Jacksonville Waterways Commission as an advisor and may have some more information. But it's some nasty stuff too, this coal ash, and it can be quite dangerous. And so it was a really unfortunate situation.
Yeah, I was also just like looking more into it. Apparently it was 9,000 tons of coal ash that had like heavy metals like arsenic, lead, and mercury. And mercury is a really, really problematic one, which when we were talking about biomagnification, that's a really big problem with like fish, because like that ends up in fish that humans eat, and biomagnification, the concentrations of mercury just increase as you move up trophic levels. So yeah. And Yeah, so Patrick had an additional question. Knowing what you know about the ash, would you feel comfortable using the beaches off Mayport/Hannah Park?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, at this point, especially, I mean, it's been widely dispersed, with the tides and wave action, and it's probably it's not really concentrated and enough there's not concentrated enough in terms of exposure. So you're not going to get exposed to enough of the ash to actually probably be much of a health risk at this point. But at the time, we weren't sure, because it had just happened and people were still using the beach. And unfortunately, another problem is that the local government did not really do a sufficient job of notifying the public of the potential risks. And so people were out there swimming and surfing very close to where the barge was located, and they weren't notified in a timely manner as to the potential risk by our local government. So that's another thing too, is, I think that in this whole discussion, it's really critical that local government engage the community in these decisions that are made and informing the community about what the potential health risks are and the solutions. I think transparency and, accountability are really critical.
Yeah, definitely, especially on like transparency and communication, because again, there's clearly not enough of that between officials and the public, and between like the public and what we really know about these sites and how they're affecting us. Um, so yeah. Yeah, if anyone
Well,
has
and I think too, what it does too, is it creates distrust in the government too. If we feel like they're not they're not living up to their responsibilities, or they're not for some reason telling us, giving us information that could be important to help protect our health, that it seems like they're hiding this information from us, or they're intentionally trying. In some cases, it's just, frankly, it's just bureaucracy. Like in this case with the barge, a lot of it had to do with all these different agencies. No one knew. It was kind of a little bit of a gray area of which agency should take the lead. And so some of it was bureaucratic reasons that they kind of drug their feet on it. But, and so I think that's really critical, is because the public, we need to be able to trust our government, that they're actually working for us and looking out for us.
Yeah, and about government and like trusting the government, there's I did some research on like sociological like trends and like trusting government. First of all, it's very clear and like has been proven time and time again that when citizens trust the government tends to work better. You need trust in order to have good governance, in order to have policies that are, actually helping people, that people feel are helping them. And without that, now there's this like rift between, the people that are making these decisions for us and what we're feeling. And that's just never good. That like discontent, I guess. And also kind of going back to what we're like our first topic, from what I found, it does seem that like people of color are less trusting of the government, and as well as people with lower socioeconomic status are also less trusting of the government, which also just kind of like ties into everything that we're talking about with like social injustice and inequality and all of that. So yeah.
Yeah, and for good reason,
Yeah.
because there's been, like in Jacksonville, we had the consolidation of our city government and county government. There was a lot of promises made too to a lot of the communities in the northwest Jacksonville that remain unfulfilled. And then, of course, when we look at the Superfund sites, we're talking about the incinerator ash sites. It was clear that the city knew about the problem and the potential health impacts for years before they ever took action. And so that distrust still exists today among people that were around at that time.
Definitely. So yeah. If I don't know if anyone else has any other questions or if there's anything else.
I had a question, and it's probably more for Jimmy, and that is, what about rising sea levels in our area? is that going to have an impact on Superfund sites?
Absolutely. And it's not just sea level rise either. It's just all the impacts from climate change, like more intense rain events, which cause runoff. Yes, when you see sea level rise, you're also having higher water table. The water table rises too, so it makes it less distance in some cases where these contaminants have to filter down into the groundwater. And then, of course, these storms are becoming more intense. There was actually a study done a couple of years ago that demonstrated, I don't have the statistics with me right now, but how a large number of Superfund sites in this country are highly at risk from climatic impacts, which are going to make it much harder to contain these contaminants on site. And so that's absolutely a big concern. It's like, it's the same thing, Dennis, it's with septic tanks. Septic tanks that as we see sea level rise, we see those groundwater levels rise, those septic tanks don't work anymore. And so those septic tanks end up leaching, fecal coliform and contaminants into the waterways that before they may have actually filtered down through the soils and been treated or removed. And so it's a huge problem that's exacerbating the discharge of pollutants into our waterways.
Yeah, and I also wanted to add on the location of Superfund sites. I read a note. I also don't have the exact number, but like a vast majority are located in like environmentally vulnerable areas, like areas very susceptible to things like flooding and like heavy rain and like things like that would, like we've been saying, like kind of compound this issue in the presence of these contaminants. So there's like a very like exponential effect, I think, of like everything altogether.
Absolutely. Well, that's like, we talked about earlier in the Ribault River area and Moncrief Creek area. It's an extremely low-lying area to begin with, highly vulnerable to flooding and storm surge. And and a lot of these contaminants are located literally right on the banks of the waterway. So it's gonna make it potentially easier for those chemicals to be transported into the waterways, which then, as we talked about earlier, once they're in there, it's really hard to get them out.
No, yeah,
So is
definitely.
They don't break down quickly over time either. That's the one thing too, is these
Oh, yeah.
chemicals can last for decades. In fact, they're the one chemical compound you may have heard of. It's known as PFAS or PFOS. It's called the forever chemical because it literally almost lasts forever. It takes so long for it to break down. And this is something that's pervasive. There's some at Superfund sites, of course, but it's a chemical that was used. It's used for things like Teflon coating in your pots and pans. It's used for waterproof repellent on your rain jacket or on your fabric on your couch, for stain resistance. And this stuff is everywhere. It's actually probably in our bodies, all of us that are on this town hall. And it doesn't break down, and it can cause all kinds of environmental and obviously human health impacts.
Yeah, and the Teflon especially, I've been hearing so much about like nonstick pans. If you scratch that Teflon, you are going to be eating that. And it's very scary to think about. Yeah.
So is the answer to eliminate as much of these Superfund sites as possible?
Yeah, we need to, as I think we talked earlier, it's really about, it's going to cost a lot of money. As I just mentioned, there's 21 billion that was in the infrastructure bill. That's a staggering amount of money, and I'm sure that's not enough to clean them all up. And so, and these Superfund sites, many of them are, decades old. And so it's something that it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of diligence and commitment from our elected leaders to make it happen, and make it happen quickly. Because, and even sometimes, when we talk about containment at the sites, remediation, it doesn't always mean removing the contaminants. It means trying to contain it, capping it, the soil, or trying to build, walls to contain it like they are at Kerr-McGee. But who's to know how do we know if that's going to, how permanent that situation is, and when do we need to go back? And infrastructure inevitably fails, right? So when do we know if that needs to be replaced or updated, and what the impacts of climate change over time are going to have, like you mentioned too, Dennis.
I'm just wondering if the city, is there someone in the city that's taken on responsibility? Does the resiliency officer, for instance, having them now on board, are they taking steps to see that funding is made available?
I have not talked to Ann Colnese, the CRO, specifically about this, but I'm sure it's on her radar. But I think where Public Works, because it's actually the city had to, there was a lawsuit actually for at least for the incinerator ash sites. There was a lawsuit in 2005 that required the city expedite the remediation and actually requires them to clean it up. And they have been appropriating money. They've actually, I think, spent over $185 million to date since about 2000 cleaning up these sites. And there is money appropriate. I just talked to a gentleman who's overseeing it in the Public Works Department last week, and he thinks there's enough money to finish at least the projects that they have right now, which will get us to, he said, about, I think he said 99% cleaned up. But 1% is also along the shoreline, which is more challenging in these low-lying areas, and it's still going to be expensive. And so we've got to make sure that additional money to get us over the finish line is appropriated. And I think, the good news is we have a mayor that has made a commitment to many of the areas of town that are impacted by Superfund sites, specifically Northwest Jacks, and said she's committed to, fulfilling the promises of the past. And I think this is one of those promises that hopefully she'll make sure happens.
And one last question from Patrick is, are our local representatives in DC, Bean and Rutherford, aware of our financial needs to clean up these sites? I would assume they are.
I would assume. I tell you what, one of the challenges we have, and that's what we're also looking into, is with the incinerator ashes specifically, the city is financially obligated to, because they are the responsible party. The city is actually the ones that put the incinerator ash on those sites. They're financially responsible for paying for it and are not eligible for funding from the EPA.
Oh.
And I was kind of surprised to learn that just recently. So we're looking at, we don't know if maybe some of the new funding that's coming out of the Biden administration, maybe some of it would apply, but the traditional funding sources would not apply to the incinerator ash. So the city's been responsible for the cleanup effort. Now there are some other types of Superfund sites that are eligible, for cleanup, or brownfields that need to be redeveloped. And hopefully we're looking at those opportunities.
We have one last question from Dr. Pinto. Are waterfront sites prioritized?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of Superfund sites, you would have hoped that would have been the first place they started, but it looks like, from what I've learned, it looks like it's the last place they're cleaning up, because we're almost there. And what areas, like, for instance, in the Ribault area, it's the shoreline along Lonnie Miller, along Ribault River, that will still need to be remediated after this next phase of remediation. And then also Moncrief Creek, the upland areas along Moncrief have been remediated, but not along the banks so there's still ash in the banks, which is obviously closest to the waterway and most easiest to run off and get into Moncrief. So I don't understand why they worked in that direction. It worked towards it seems like that would be the first place you'd want to start. But you know, I'm hopeful at least that, you know, now that they've got most of the upland remediation completed, maybe that, you know, we can really push to get the funding to, you know, like I said before, let's get us over the finish line and get this job done.
Yeah, definitely. I also wanted to mention, I know we're like a little short on time, but in terms of like local representatives, I know that the new mayor of Jacksonville has like a chief resiliency officer, and Koglinis, I believe that's how you say her name. So it does seem like there is some significant work being done to, you know, like promote like environmental issues. And yeah, so it does seem like things are, you know, looking upward. But yeah, so thank you everyone for being here tonight. Thank you, Jimmy, for, you know, speaking and like offering all of this information that you have. I know I really appreciate it. Dennis, we all really appreciate it. And yeah, I've included another link if you would like to volunteer with the St. John's Riverkeeper, or just, you know, like learn a little bit more about the organization. This is okay. I put the link in the chat for the QR code as well. And then yeah, and then we just have some contact information if anyone would like to contact any of us at any other point. Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. I think this was really great. Yeah, I had a really great time.
Well,
And you did a great job, by the way.
Yes. Once again, I want to thank you, Harmonie and Jimmy, for being with us tonight. This was a great experience. We learned an awful lot, and we know we've got some work to do as citizens to support the work you're doing. I did want to mention that our next meeting is on March 28th, ending gun violence and in Jacksonville. And then on April 2nd, we have a town hall on COVID-19 impact, then, now, and tomorrow. So we look forward to having all of you as guests, and invite your friends. And again, on behalf of the Jacksonville Urban League, our president, Richard Danford, and all the team at the Center for Advocacy and Social Justice, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jimmy and Harmonie.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you.
We want to have a great evening.